Everyone, thank you for coming on this glorious afternoon on Friday. That's a real sign of dedication to Leah's work. So, the real pleasure to introduce Leah, who does a lot of work on conservation decision making, policy. We'll hear about now. She's Professor of Conservation Science at Arizona State University, but is here and just arrived, but is here until the end of June. So, if any of you want to follow up with the conversations on things that you hear today, I'm sure we're happy to do that. And after this event, we'll have some informal drinks around the corner in the diversity room that you're all welcome to have a more informal conversation as well. And I'll just mention the last seminar of this academic year series will be next Friday, although we have a few ad hoc ones appearing on the schedule already. And that's going to be Adriani Esquivel-Mulbert from Cambridge University, talking about the forest dynamics in a changing planet. That'll be next Friday here as a last of our series. So thank you for your patience, and over to you.
Before you go, how do I advance?
Yeah.
Oh, just use that.
Okay.
So, but we can just keep talking quietly. But do you want the mic on just in case?
Sure,
Like, sure. That way I don't interrupt you.
Yeah.
Plus you want, which I'll just come up and hand it to you.
Okay, but for now, talking to the Zoom.
You just talk towards this way,
Yeah.
maybe like 2 minutes, and then we can figure it out.
Okay, great.
Okay, so is it okay to walk around or better?
Yeah, that's.
Okay, well, hi everyone. It's
I think actually
stay back there. Sorry.
You can
That's a good point,
once the microphone comes.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Yadavinder and team, for the invitation to speak today. And thank you to all for coming out of the beautiful sunshine to be in this room. So I really appreciate that. I have to admit, I probably would not have done the same. As Yadavinder mentioned, my name is Leah Gerber. I just arrived from ASU in Tempe, Arizona. I was here last year, starting in January 2025. I then did not choose the right season to arrive, so I arrived in January and was here until around now. And then I learned that now is the time to come. So again, I just arrived and I am here until the end of June. I came before as an Oxford Martin Fellow and also a fellow at Wadham College, and I've retained both appointments. So I plan to continue returning to Oxford as long as they let me. I really love it here.
There you go. Yeah, hold it down for a second.
Sorry. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to you about my work on conservation science and action. Specifically, I'm going to put the mic on here, I think. There. How's that look? Is it working? Okay. So conservation science and action. I'm really passionate about conservation and biodiversity, addressing the biodiversity crisis. And as I've reflected on how we can bring science to address this problem, I've questioned my own impact. What is the impact of the science that I've done in addressing the biodiversity crisis? And more broadly, what is the role of science in addressing the biodiversity crisis? And so today I want to sort of tell you a few stories about my own work in this space. Okay. So I've spent most of my career on this question of bringing science to decision making with the hope that that will get to impact. And recently, I've spent a lot of time thinking about governance and institutions and decisions, and less time thinking about ecology. And I realized that this may be kind of a little bit dangerous for someone who's trained as a quantitative population biologist, but nonetheless, I'm enjoying the learning process, and you'll find in my presentation today, I may have more questions than answers. But I'm going to give a couple of examples of some of the work that I've done at this interface between science, policy, and practice. We're all set. Good.
The mouse on that key, right?
Is it?
Or is it on the screen?
Got it. Okay. And by the way, I did take these pictures. So showing that I have done some cool field work with whales back in the population biology days. So my main question is, what should conservation science look like for impact? And we've become really good at producing knowledge. We're really good at designing and, or excuse me, not designing, understanding and documenting the problems. We become really good at that, providing information, but less strong in curbing the biodiversity loss. We're producing knowledge and biodiversity continues to decline. So how can we fix this? How can we better get to the outcomes that we care about, specifically around biodiversity? And how is it that humans have become so scientifically advanced, yet we continue to degrade the systems that support life on Earth? So let's look at the sort of traditional scientific theory of change. Often, scientists, I'm not characterizing everyone, but often the norm is that we're curious. So we do some research and we publish it. We may do some outreach associated with that publication. And we assume that, we hope that there'll be more awareness because we've disseminated our results. And that awareness will lead to impact. So I'm going to challenge this traditional theory of change and suggest that even the best science doesn't guarantee that the discoveries will have a real impact. So I would propose that for scientific knowledge to be translated into real action, a number of conditions are required. First, we need to design the science in a way that it links directly to policy. What is the policy or a decision? Also, public understanding is essential. What if the public doesn't care, then it's an abstract academic exercise. And furthermore, as we've learned in the US recently, policymakers also need to support a call for change. So I've, in previous work, described this as a misalignment between the logic of inquiry and the logic of action. Specifically, we often have curiosity, we pursue our research, we publish it, and we want that uptake. But the knowledge that we're producing is not aligned with the knowledge that's needed for decision-making around biodiversity conservation. My previous work has suggested that by working directly with decision makers or policymakers in this co-production process, we can better address biodiversity loss. But I don't think it's that simple. I think there's more. And so I wanted to sort of tell you a couple of tales, no pun intended, with the whale, starting with this sort of personal arc in my own research. Working on, for many years, I was on the scientific delegation for the International Whaling Commission and have provided a lot of technical expertise into the IWC. I'm going to give you one example. I'm going to then switch over to the US and talk about my work around biodiversity conservation with the Endangered Species Act. And then I'll talk about something I'm working on right now in designing a new school for conservation at my university. So let's start with a whale example. So this was probably 15 or so years ago. The decision context was that, and I will take credit for that other whale picture as well. There was an assertion made by pro-whaling nations that scientific research has shown that whales consume huge quantities of fish, making this a matter of food security. And therefore, we should actually cull whales for food security. We should kill whales so that there are more fish for humans. So that was something that was being brought up and stymieing progress in the discussions at the IWC, International Whaling Commission. So I know Yadavinder's group, and perhaps many of you know how ecosystems work. They're a little more complex than having just two trophic levels where it's like whales and fish. In fact, there are often lots of complexities where whales may eat at one trophic level, and then that species may eat at another. So really, assessing the potential impact of whales on fish requires more complicated ecosystem models, not just assuming we remove fish and then whales will increase. And furthermore, in the context in which this claim was being made, biologically, these baleen whales are known to migrate seasonally. And the claim was being made in areas where they where they breed and give birth, not their feeding areas. So they're typically not in these lower latitude geographies where this claim was being made. They're not known to feed anyway. So this is an example of science where we kind of think that the assertion is outrageous and why do we even need to study it? But the science and the publication needed to be there to address the issue and put it to rest, more or less. And this is an example of the science being very tailored and designed for that decision-making and policy process. So we did extensive ecosystem models using EcoPath and EcoSim. And what this figure shows is, let's see. So if you're looking at the x-axis, we have, we're comparing for two ecosystems, Northwest Africa and the Caribbean, what would be the effect of removing whales versus removing fishing on fishing biomass increase. And you see that there's pretty much no impact of removing whales. Whereas, wow, if we stop fishing, we see increases in fish biomass. And this was under a wide range of assumptions and scenarios. So it was very clear, unequivocally, we showed that there was a negligible impact of removing whales on fish versus putting a fishing moratorium on commercial fish biomass. I have found, and this is just a hypothesis, that again, in the US, I know internationally, Nature is a journal that gets a lot of attention. In the US, there's something called, well, in science, particularly science policy, because the papers that I published in science policy have been really important levers of change in terms of like the general dialogue, getting people talking, changing the narrative. And so, again, this is part of my thinking about what gets to impact. So what happened? We did this, I had 2 postdocs, a whole research team. It was actually commissioned. It was the only time in my career where a funding agency called me up and said, would you like to do this study? We will give you all this money. They didn't want to taint the results or anything, but we got the best, trained ecosystem modelers. We worked for a couple of years. We went and presented it at the International Whaling Commission meeting. The great news is that when we presented it, the pro-whaling nation said, oh, well, yeah, you're right. We never said that. That's not a problem. So that was effective, right? They no longer were making this absurd claim. And they weren't just making the claim, but they were actually marketing it in these developing nations providing fishery support and sort of getting them, more or less paying them to sign on to vote with pro-whaling nations in these International Whaling Commission discussions. We did a lot of outreach, a lot of travel to these tropical breeding areas in the Caribbean and Northwest Africa. And in a lot of cases, there was just misinformation. So we sort of got the communities to start thinking more holistically about ecosystems. We engaged them in the modeling process, the parameterization of the models. And this did get them to start thinking about what the real problems are and not necessarily saying we should just cull whales and that's going to solve the problem. Now, sort of the bad news is that to date, the IWC, which is an extremely political intergovernmental organization, continues to assert that modeling can't be used to predict these interactions. So in a sense, it's keeping it a little squishy such that we can't get to an agreement. You know, if we don't accept the results of the model, then we can't use it for decision making. Nonetheless, this whales eat fish argument has not been used, at least for the context in the southern latitudes where they had been heavily marketing the approach. So perhaps that's impact. Perhaps. There is the counterfactual. We don't know what would have happened otherwise. But let's go back to sort of what I've learned and what I'm learning along the way. So how does this model apply? Well, first, instead of starting with curiosity, we started with the problem. And we did follow this normal path, or this traditional path. I would say we had some impact, but not as satisfactory. We still have a biodiversity crisis. This is one little thing. It did improve, produce some impact, again, but I'm not satisfied with it. In the context of IWC, the outcomes still depend on ongoing governance, enforcement, and political will in this context. So let's move over to the Endangered Species Act in the US. I've worked on this for a really long time, and there's some interesting things going on in the US around biodiversity and anything to do with the environment, as you may have heard. So in the US, the Endangered Species Act is arguably, is the most powerful piece of environmental legislation. It was passed in 1973. It's a very strong act in terms of limiting human activities and protecting biodiversity. The overarching goal is to prevent extinction and to recover species that have been impacted by human activity. So one of the problems, and this is actually not just a problem in the US, is around the world. We only are funding a small fraction of what is needed to recover species that are listed as endangered or threatened. In the US, it's approximately only 20% of what is needed is actually funded. So that sort of explains why species are not recovering. We need to actually implement the recovery actions like translocation or eradication of invasive species. We need to implement those to see the impacts. This is just demonstrating in the US that this pattern exists across taxa. So you see from plants all the way to invertebrates, mammals, amphibians. Strikingly, you see these blue bars, they represent the number of species that receive less than what is needed. That's across the board, but you do see these taxonomic biases also, where overall, there are more plant species that are imperiled and most of them receive less. Now, there are a couple of exceptions. So an example first of a plant is the beautiful pawpaw. We're spending about $4,600 per year, which represents 0.04% of what's needed. So we're just not doing anything, even though they're listed. There are a few. So the ones that are shown in red, some species get enough or more, and that's a good thing. One example is the bull trout, which is a Pacific Northwest fish species that's benefited greatly from water infrastructure development, water management. So that it's really the recovery costs have to do with water management, which are quite significant. So the takeaway here is we're not funding these listed species. And this is again, a global problem. I'm focusing on the US as a case study. So several years ago, I published this paper where I looked at all the data. I compiled the data from all of the recovery plans, and I organized the data into which species were not receiving enough funding, i.e. that were in deficit, compared to the ones that were receiving enough or surplus, enough or more. So that these are looking at deficit and surplus. 2 points. Most species are in deficit. And also, you note that when we are adequately funding things, we don't have as many declining species. So that relative difference between the declining and increase is less. So it suggests that if we actually fund the actions needed, we're going to see recovery. Okay, so that all makes sense. And I published it in PNAS, and makes sense, right? We should just start funding things. It's very clear. But no. So this is my little AI generated image to tell a quick story where I happened to be in Washington, DC for some meetings. And I read this article in the New York Times that was basically said, the federal agencies that are responsible for listed species, US Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service, have agreed to, have made an agreement with all of the environmental NGOs. Basically, there are several NGOs, and what they do is sue the agencies. You must take action. And it's an important role to sue the agencies, because sometimes it's the only mechanism. There's an actual process and a trigger. When they're sued, they have to do a review. The problem was that the federal agencies couldn't do anything strategically or proactively because their hands were tied with focusing on dealing with lawsuits. So they had come to an agreement where the NGOs agreed to stop suing them for a period, I think it was 6 months, so that the agency could figure out how to deal with this problem. And I thought, wow, I just published this paper. Maybe they would be interested in, starting to apply some of these approaches in thinking about allocating funding in a sort of efficient, thoughtful, strategic way. And I reached out to someone who was quoted into the article. And I said, hey, I'm in DC. I'd love, I work on these problems. I'm really interested and I'm curious, would you be open to meeting? And he said, yes. So I went over and met with him. We had a great conversation. And I said, well, how are you going to deal with this? You have this amount of time to come up with a strategy to address, this dearth of funding, to best use the limited resources that you have for maximizing conservation outcomes. And he basically didn't have a strategy. It was sort of like, we're going to figure it out. And I said, this is the kind of thing we work on. Would you be open to collaboration? And he said, sure. And basically, at that point, we put together a team. It was scientists from all over the world, from Australia and New Zealand, where they've been really ahead in prioritization work. And then got a team from US. He basically appointed a team from all over the US from different regions to join. And we got some funding. There used to be a center called the National Social Ecological Synthesis Center. We got funding to convene there over a period of 2 years to address this together, as opposed to the academics going off and figuring it out and throwing it over the dump truck. So we thought, okay, this is going to work. So let's see how that went. Okay, so what we did, and this is a fun schematic to describe the approach that we took. So if I could change the world such that all of the funding that is needed for recovering biodiversity would be allocated, that is what I would like. But I am not in a position to make those choices. There are a lot of factors that influence funding allocations. But what I can do is use the best available science and data to say, given a fixed budget, how can we maximize our outcomes? So there's a very simple mathematical formulation known as the knapsack problem. I'm definitely not arguing putting these endangered species in your backpack. But here, this schematic is some species, if you only have a certain size of a backpack or a certain budget, how do we pick which to choose? And essentially what this shows us is we're going to focus on, but there's a very simple equation here. The score is simply the benefit. I'm wondering if there's a pointer here. Do we have a pointer? Oh, right, thanks. Okay. So this very simple equation here. So the score is benefit multiplied by success over cost. So if we can estimate these values, which we actually could do because we have data on the benefit. Cost is a little bit more tricky, but the recovery plans include data on cost, although they're not perfect. That's a whole nother hornet's nest. But based on best available data, we can gather these scores for all listed species, and there are something like a little bit over 1,500 listed species. So for each, we gather these data and we get a score. And then we say, let's fund the ones that have the highest score, i.e. the species that have the most likelihood of recovery at the least cost. And then we say for a fixed budget, here are the species that we could fit in the knapsack, i.e. or given a fixed budget, what's the best, how can we achieve the best outcome given that fixed budget? So this is the overall approach that we took throughout this 2-year working group. A lot of it was pulling the data together, getting everyone on the same page. I will also say that this simple algorithm assumes that we're focusing on cost efficiency, and there are a lot of other ways. For example, we might care about species vibrancy, or we might have other criteria for selecting species. We can explore based on a number of criteria what that ranking should be. But for this example, we went with cost. So what this looks like, again, if you have a data sheet, I call it a return on investment approach to saving species. If you have, these sweet D, E, and A, and C, and D, which project should we fund? And we gather the data and we say, oh, well, these are the ones that we should fund for a fixed budget. Very clear. In other words, we can achieve a lot more with a given budget by being strategic and using this algorithm than an ad hoc approach. And I'll show you specifically in a more concrete terms. So here you see, this is on the y-axis is that annual budget. Yeah, sorry, that was the x-axis. The y-axis is the number of species recovered. The two things I want to convey here. So the blue line is what number of species are we going to save in using an ad hoc approach or incremental increases in funding. The red line is if we use the optimal approach, what we're going to save. So you see just a remarkably, like a striking difference. If we use the optimization algorithm, we're going to see a lot more recovery. In one of the papers that I published, it was something like for the same amount of funding, we could protect 200 more species. If we think about it this way, we allocate it based on which are likely to recover. So the two things I want to point out, one is just the difference between the red and the blue line, striking difference. The other is in terms of for decision makers, and I remain hopeful that describing it in terms of for a particular, say, $125 million, so going from A to B, the current budget is at, say 125 million, double it. What are we going to get? We can say, for this amount of money, here are the number of species you will save. So it's very clear. There's a lot of sentiment that, we can't protect them, nothing works. Well, this shows what you will get for a particular investment. So that was exciting, and it was co-produced. The agency was excited. We started to work together to develop an actual tool that the agency was using. It is called the Recovery Prioritization Tool. And I can give you the link for it. It lives online. And it allows us to ask these types of questions. How many more species could be recovered with a 10% budget increase? Or what would be the impact of changes in where we focus regionally? We also worked, ASU has something called the Decision Theater, and we have these locations in different parts of the world, but there's one in Washington, D.C. So we did some convenings with the senior administrators. And this was a way I have found this really effective to, instead of just giving, here's a publication with like some graphs, it's live, and they can say, oh, well, what if we did this? And we see the impacts of different choices across multiple dimensions that people might care about. So working in a more iterative approach and looking at the impacts of different decisions on what the outcomes can be. How am I doing for it? I know, how am I doing for time?
50 minutes.
Okay, that's perfect. So this was just a remarkable success at the time. Huge policy implications, lots of media uptake, even a couple of appearances doing congressional testimony. It really raised the thinking. The agency was taking it up. It stimulated public discourse. So I thought this was a success in terms of impact. So let's revisit this. So again, we started with curiosity. We co-produced the research. We did more than publications. We did capacity building, we did tools, lots of media outreach. Again, we got to impact, but there are politics, which I will get to. And I think this is my segue, given the current administration and sort of the rollbacks on funding for science, we're now in a whole different world where, science doesn't guarantee policy change, especially when the whole decision system shifts. And so this is something that's happening now. One of the most important clauses of the Endangered Species Act is that it allows for the protection of habitat. As most of you know, especially Sandra, who is the lead of the IPBES, habitat loss is the primary driver of extinction. There is a pending rescission, i.e., the habitat is considered as harm. So that under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, you're not allowed to harass, harm, capture, or kill endangered species. And if you do, you have to go through this really elaborate consultation process. Well, we're actually in the final stage of a ruling that removes habitat from harm. Harm cannot be considered, cannot include habitat. It only can include, like, if you see a species and you shoot it, which is unfortunate because habitat loss is the primary driver. So this is really troubling. And this map is showing
some estimates that we put together on the implications. Let me back up a step. So this has been happening for some years. I actually did submit this to science policy, fingers crossed. Currently, it made it to review. But last summer, a journalist from The Atlantic called me up and said, well, if this happens, how many species are going to go extinct? And I thought, wow, that is a really good question. Let me do some back of the envelope calculations based on some NatureServe data. We don't have very good data. IUCN is excellent globally, but in the US, we don't have very good data. So we did some calculations. I thought, you know what? I should put this out into the literature. So the estimate is between 25 and 155 near-term extinctions. And this ruling is expected like this month in May. That's alarming. I mean, frankly, just one extinction is alarming. So that's what's happening now. And, many of us who work in these systems are wondering, like, how do we keep, should we keep doing this? What's our role when things like this happen? And so I guess my approach is I just keep putting it out there. I follow this theory of change. I'm going to get it out there, be loud about the implications, hope that this will pass, i.e. this administration will pass. The maps that I'm showing are estimates of habitat. These are habitats that will be lost, and there's names of species that are mapped on there. So that's what's happening now. Now, one other thing that I have been working on recently is, given what is happening in our federal government system and how fragile it is, what other mechanisms are there to protect biodiversity and not just respond to these rollbacks? Some of you may have heard of Project 2025. This was basically the core of what was used to dismantle the federal government in funding for scientific research. So we made this new idea. Well, we're going to start Conservation 2050. Let's reimagine, because we pretty much have taken apart all federal agencies that do scientific research. So let's seize this moment and be proactive. When we take it all apart, how do we want to rebuild it? So this is something I started to think about, this Conservation 2050. The way we're designing this and working with a number of conservation NGOs and other academic colleagues is to convene a set of think tank working groups in Washington, DC, produce some consensus documents, and engage with congressional testimony, continue communicating with policymakers. It really is a bipartisan issue. Nature, who doesn't care about nature? So this is what we plan to do. All right, so back to my concept here. I'm a quantitative population biologist. I worked on whales, but I care about biodiversity. So again, how do we, as scientists, as scholars who have this passion and get training and go out into the world to produce knowledge, how do we do it? Well, it turns out that bringing knowledge to action is really complicated. And it's not just publishing papers and hoping for uptake. It depends on opportunities, like the opportunity to meet with my agency administrator in DC, to maintain the relationships with people where sometimes I would publish something and hope that there would be uptake, but no. But because I maintained the relationship, sometimes later, we're interested in that work. So that is really important. And also, the challenge is trying to make change, given that there's so much uncertainty in our knowledge, opportunities, and relationships. So this is my pivot moment to kind of reflect briefly on how I'm running out of time, but that I really am questioning my own impact and thinking about what is the best way to get to impact as an academic scientist. And I think that it's important to be this reflexive and think about what can we learn along the way? How can we improve this process? How can we start redesigning systems? And so as you see, this traditional model is very linear, focused on output, very passive. I don't think this works. I'm not saying everyone needs to have a goal of having impact, but if your goal is to do science with impact, I think we need a different model. This is one idea for what that model is. And what's implicit here is that an impact doesn't, you don't achieve it, it emerges from a complex system. And so embedding science in all parts of this system, including co-production, translation, analysis along the way, is perhaps another approach to get to outcome. And I realize this is super busy, this slide, but I was dreaming up a sort of idea of what we really need. And this is, again, something that we concluded with EFS Global Assessment many years ago, is that what we need is transformative change. And I feel that everything that I have talked about, from going from the technical, the whale example, the endangered species work, going from policy to politics, all of that is so incremental. In the biodiversity loss, we continue to lose species. So we're not solving the problem. We may be making incremental changes. But there's this concept, actually, this Berkana two-loop model for transformational change. So there are two axes here. The first loop is sort of, given the current system, we do this work and we expect system change. The second loop is a path to transformation. And so you're sort of looking at this problem in two different ways. One is technical, but we're also reframing the problem. We're translating knowledge into choices, but we're also redesigning policies. So the idea is that my hope, and this is something I'm also writing about as part of the North America Biodiversity Climate Change Assessment, is how can we reconcile actionable and transformative science to achieve biodiversity outcomes? And my working theory is that we have to keep trying. We have to keep taking these incremental steps. And that path will lead us to the transformative change. That is my hope. But again, it's a working hypothesis, and I told you that I would have more questions than answers. So I know we're running out of time, and I guess I'll just really quickly run through this. While I was here the last couple of years, I have had a chance to work on something really exciting, and that is designing a new system, specifically in the academic institution. So rather than talking about policy, I'm talking about the general populace. So how can we design institutional change in a way that leads to effective biodiversity conservation? Two things are problematic. One, we need to move from individual efforts to systems, and from isolated projects to broader context. I had the opportunity over the last few years to develop a significant proposal that was recently funded by the Rob Walton Foundation. It was a very significant gift for a new School of Conservation Futures. And it's a really different kind of school, as you can see here from the vision and mission. So I'm just going to read a few words from the mission. We're going to work across knowledge systems, not just the scientific, the Western knowledge system, but indigenous, many different knowledge systems, with diverse local and global partners, aspiring change makers to restore the kinship and reciprocity between people and nature, to co-develop new solutions and models of learning for the protection and resilience of biodiversity. So there's a lot that's different in their traditional, theory of change here. A key piece of this is to reweave indigenous knowledge. And that is a whole fascinating, interesting challenge that we have largely ignored in conservation, I would argue. So some of the principles that we're literally launching it right now. The first classes will happen in fall. So we wrote the proposal. In fact, a lot of my sabbatical was spent writing this proposal. And now we've been setting up hiring plans. We're hiring a bunch of people. You know my name. If you go to my LinkedIn page, I have posted, we're hiring a half a dozen faculty, but not just tenure track faculty, professors of practice, clinical professors, different types of approaches, different metrics. So this is, again, an idea, an approach to changing the system, again, getting at this transformational idea where we're not just in a system where we publish papers and expect outcomes. That won't be the metric. We're going to have different metrics for tenure. Oh, and we also are going to be based in Arizona with hubs all over. So hopefully I'll get to keep coming back to Oxford. I'm going to zip through this again, just a different model for institutional change. I mentioned earlier that we're specifically focused on integration of different knowledge systems. And this is a really challenging goal. And there's not really, as far as I know, there have been lots of papers about how we weave knowledge systems, but there's not sort of a best practice. I think, our starting point is whatever knowledge system we come with, let's make that explicit. And ask a lot of questions and design processes that share authority. So setting up these, ethical principles for how we work together to kind of start to overcome the kind of colonial legacies of conservation is deeply embedded in our goal. And in fact, one of my co-authors of the proposal is herself Indigenous. So it's been absolutely delightful to have the chance to work on this with our team. This is my pause, but I'm going to keep going because we're running out of time. And my takeaway here is the future of conservation depends on what we do with what we know. Passive publication of even the best science is not going to get to outcomes. The failure of conservation is not a failure of our knowledge system. It's a failure of linking the knowledge to the decision-making or the policy. So there are some things we can do to rectify this. For example, co-production with end users, doing science in collaboration, embracing different knowledge systems, communicating all along the way, investing in relationships with decision makers who trust you. And when the timing is right and they need your input, you're available. And again, start with your decision versus curiosity. Again, if you have an interest in having impact. With that, I appreciate your time in this windowless room on a Friday afternoon, and I will be around until the end of June, and would love to have chats with many of you. So thanks for your attention.
I can give permission of hooking up the sediments. Thank you very much for that. So we can open up to questions now. Manu, do you want to kick off? There's a great.
Oh, great.
This working?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Well, thanks, Leah, for inspiring talk. Can I share a struggle with the timing of things? Science for impact. I feel like the pace of change, whether it's climate change or biodiversity crisis or lobbying from big money, whether it's whaling or the ag sector, things move so fast, or political decisions that can change with signature. They change so fast, and science is so slow. If we detect a problem right now of something's burning, it takes us a year. If we're fast, it takes us a year to publish something. How can we fix the timing or the being sane? Should we be ahead of the problem? Should the scientific community, be ahead? Or I don't know if there is an answer to this, but how can we do things better? How can science move faster to address the timing questions and then, be more effective?
Yeah, no, that's a really important question. I think you've identified a really key structural challenge between, the systems in which we do science and the policy decision-making or even journal, talking with journalists, they want things right away and we tend to have lots of caveats. One analogy that a sort of metaphor that I think we need to address this is in conservation, we're trying to quickly address challenges for particular species or ecosystems, but we don't have enough information on it. And so what we tend to do is say, well, we need to collect more data, we need to better understand this before we take an action. The analogy would be the medical system, where, someone, cuts their arm off, or just not off, just say they cut their arm, and comes into the ER and says, I cut my arm. Well, what happened? What did you do? What's the best way of dealing with it? Well, there's data on what one should do. So use the best available data, address it, tie up the bandage of the biodiversity loss, take action, even if it's not perfect. So if we could, I call this there was a book called The Checklist Manifesto, where it's like we learn as we go, but we don't delay action. So if we could do that in conservation, where we're taking action quickly while we study and gather data on what works. So I think that's one important answer to your question, but it's a tough one.
But I think part of it was perhaps what you showed there, that a model of being embedded in the system. So you have your trusted media, trusted policymakers, trusted relationships that you're working in. You're not waiting for publications to come out before disseminating. You're disseminating in real time your expertise and insights.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Today.
Thank you. So my question is about kind of institutional memory, the dismantling of science and stuff. So for context, I started college at the beginning of 2020 when everything was shut down, and it was very present to me that by the time we could do things again, for example, start a sports club, people didn't know how to because there was a big lapse in people doing anything. And I think that's kind of a similar thing with something like the Trump administration. So you're looking at now, it's kind of another timeline question, but different. All of the early and young career researchers that are currently undergrads and grad students are often learning about like policies and decision making and different laws as they're being dismantled. Like that's the first time we ever hear about them. So then by the time, hopefully in 2028, hopefully not later than that, those same early career researchers will be the ones that are supposed to be taking on those jobs of policy change. We have no working memory and no professional memory of those spaces. Wow. So as someone who you worked in all those spaces before they were dismantled, you're in a lot of these decision-making spaces, what advice would you give for students and young career researchers who are will now eventually have to rebuild a system that they never actually knew?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. That gave me chills in that it's hard. It's not an easy world to go into. And I first want to comment on another thing that I've been investing heavily in, and that is ecological grief. We all have it, and I think the early career folks have it really bad in that, in my experience, a lot of younger scholars are questioning, like, maybe I should choose a different career path because, it's futile, or, what impact can I have? And I think one thing, or later career people like me, it's exhausting to just keep going when I don't really know if what's going to work, what impact it's going to have. And the problems are just so dire that we tend to work ourselves really hard, and then people tend to burn out. So I think mindfulness and resilience in conservation is essential. So that's one thing. And I think I'll say what we're doing with the new school is making it clear how nature is not just a discipline in biology, but it really spans across all sectors, in the business sector. So really getting clear in your training, what are the different career paths where you can represent nature? And having training specifically, for example, in project management or nature finance, things that aren't traditional conservation biology is sort of a direction that I think is needed. We did a review, for example, of one of the largest NGOs, Conservation International, to find out, we were designing our curricula and we asked, like, what kind of training do you need? And it's not in, mammalogy or herpetology, it's in these things that project management, nature finance. So adapting to what is needed in the workforce and bringing that training into early career scientists is another pathway. Everyone wants to get out into the sun, I don't blame you.
I think it's a fascinating topic. I think my question, just because we were talking a lot about impact, I think it's central to your work as well as mine in media is louder.
We can't hear you very well.
Oh, sorry. I was asking about the impact angle that you were mentioning, and you mentioned the media a few times. So I wanted to know exactly what has your collaboration been with the media, and has the media played an important role? Has it played a minor role? What role has it played for you?
Yeah, it's funny. I had a juncture at some point where early in my career, I tended to avoid the media because I heard lots of horror stories about being misquoted. But now, if anyone from the media approaches me, I do as much as I can to talk to them. Because, like I said, I think it's the public discourse. People don't realize, that the average general population isn't aware of the magnitude, and it's an opportunity to reach people. So that's one thing. So I always take advantage of the opportunity. And then I develop relationships with them. So for example, this Atlantic article that came out, I kept the relationship with her. She asked this brilliant question, and then I went on and did the analysis. But along the way, I will credit her. I will, we're sort of working together in this process on getting the message out. And there's also a tight coupling, I think, between media and the policy world, like, the congressional staffers, what people read, who they see. Then I get invited to speak before, Congress and, say what I have to say, hoping that there are receptive audiences.
This is more of a kind of personal question. Like, how do you reconcile that, for example, you're generating evidence that conservation should go like in right direction, like for example, with the habitat protection, but the decisions are being taken in the other way, like the elimination of habitat in the definition of harm. How do you deal with that?
Oh, you mean personally? How do I?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I believe that, and I suppose this may be from talking with family, like my dad is much older and has lived through a lot of really challenging times. And I have confidence that this too will pass. So I hope that even if the harm rescission happens, there'll be a lot of opposition to it. And hopefully there won't be a tremendous amount of damage done in the next several years. I mean, we see that said, extinction is forever, and we're wiping out, protected areas, oil drilling. It's remarkable what we're doing. But I do have hope and sort of trust that it'll swing back in a more positive direction. And I feel that I'm working with a team of people, many of you, like you guys, who care, and there is sort of camaraderie that makes me want to keep going.
Thanks so much. That was a really interesting talk. I heard about some of the work that you're doing with biodiversity tools at the centre, and I wanted to know kind of what your intended impact is with that, both nationally and also kind of in the context of US aid cuts, which actually have a big impact
So you said biodiversity tools?
Yeah.
It's funny you mentioned USAID because we are hiring a lot of USAID people right now, really good people who just had their whole, world cut. So biodiversity tools, I think that's a great question because one of the problems with biodiversity, unlike something like climate or water, it's much easier and more concrete to measure. Biodiversity, it's like, what is it? And we can define it, but it's species and genes and ecosystems. So the first thing is defining it. And then there's the question of how do we measure it? What's a relevant indicator or metric? And there's no clear answer. And so one approach that I have started to take is developing a way for an entity to choose the right indicator for their context. I didn't talk about it today, but I've started working a lot with companies in the corporate sector on trying to quote mainstream biodiversity and decision-making, arguably because the corporate sector is having a significant impact on biodiversity. And there is interest, but they start with these simple questions of, well, what's biodiversity? How do I measure it? And so we are starting to work with a few companies using this approach where we start with, well, exactly what do we're working with a utility company in Arizona, for example, and we say, well, what do you want to achieve? Well, they want the degraded ecosystem to be restored. So that intervention will be restoration, and they want more biodiversity. So then we ask them, well, what kind? And it seems somewhat arbitrary, but I think it's all we have now because there really is no universal indicator. But again, it's similar to the story I told with the ESA. We do things and we learn as we go. And so using this very simple approach where you say, like, what is the impact we want to see? What metrics should we choose for our particular context?
Feel like one final one? Where's the last?
Is the knapsack problem the same thing as triage? And also, have you received any backlash for focusing on cost efficiency?
Those are great questions as well. So around the knapsack problem, yes, it is more or less the same as triage. And yes, I have been thrown under the bus a lot for proposing such an approach. If you noticed, I gave the disclaimer of, if I could make the decision of funding everything, I would, but I am not. So let's do what we can with what we have. But some NGOs have been very critical in saying, you're giving up on species. And in fact, I reframed the work instead of saying like reallocating. We're not talking about reallocating and taking money from one species. We're talking about if we should get more money, how do we best allocate it to maximize our conservation outcomes? But it's really tricky, specifically with some conservation NGOs. I'm not going to name names, but the ones that are more radical, they actually get income by advocating for certain species, and kind of the emotional story about this. And so when I bring this out, let's be logical, and maybe we are going to protect a bunch of plants, it's misaligned with what their whole strategy is. And that makes, I have been accused of, triage. I think I put a little headline up, triage is a dirty word. Mm-hmm. So yes, but I like to argue that I'm doing my job when I'm criticized from both sides.
Great. I think we'll wrap up there. So as I said, there's drinks around the corner, so do join us for a more informal conversation. And thank you once again. I look forward to chatting to you. When I saw your